Now, before we get into creating 3D objects here in Photoshop CS6, I just want to go over a couple of things with the interface and how you can set up the interface and workspaces to make yourself a little bit more efficient when you're working in 3D, because there's a little bit different of a workflow when you're in 3D. And I'm just going to offer some suggestions on helping you get a little bit more efficient with it and way you can set up your interface. Now, before I get into that, I'll just point this out. This desktop image that you see right here, these rings, actually was created entirely in Photoshop CS6 using 3D. I just created a couple of 3D objects and then merged them together and was applying some textures and surface properties like lighting and things like that, and was able to get a really interesting three-dimensional abstract graphic here, just kind of a couple of carbon fiber rings. And at the end of this course, you'll have the know-how to go ahead and create something like this and play around with 3D and perhaps even take it a bit further than that. So, let's dive right into the program. I'm going to go and call up Photoshop here. Now, when you're working in a particular industry, whether you're doing retouching or video, there are different panels and things for specific features in the program. So this is the versatility of Photoshop is so amazing, and that it's across so many industries. So there's different ways you can set up Photoshop for different types of work you'll be doing. And those are called workspaces. Now, under the window menu, if you go to the workspace menu, down here we have a number of preset workspaces. If you're working in photography, you have the relevant tools for photography, again with typography, painting, and of course 3D. Now, if I select that, in which it was already set in, it's got all the relevant panels for 3D right away. As you can see, I've got a 3D panel here specific to creating 3D objects and modifying them. The properties panel is relevant. The layers panel will, of course, need that because of all the 3D layers we might create. We even have the timeline visible down here because you can, in fact, do 3D animation and work with video and 3D in conjunction with each other to create some really interesting effects in there, motion graphics and such. But we're concentrating on the workspace right now. So the workspace that they have preset in here under Workspace 3D is pretty good, not necessarily the way I would like it. And this is the great thing about Photoshop, is that you can customize it to the way you work. So for instance, I actually have a workspace I've already set up for myself. I'm just going to go ahead and select that. And you can see I like to have my swatches panel visible. I want my layers panel to be as big as possible so I can see all of my layers, or most of my layers in most cases. And then what I like to do is I'm going to go ahead and call up the 3D panel and drag this out here. And I'm also going to call up my properties panel because these two panels actually work in conjunction with each other here inside the program. And now what I like to do is take the properties panel here and just dock it on the right side of the 3D panel so it moves around as a single panel. Now the reason I like to do that is when I create a 3D object, and I'll just show you real quick. Let's go ahead and just create a new document here. And inside this file, I'm just going to go ahead and create a primitive shape. Now, I'm just kind of diving into something. I'm jumping a little bit of ahead here, but just wanted to show you why this setup of these panels is relevant with the way you work in 3D. So I'm going to go to 3D, new mesh from layer, and we'll just do a mesh preset. Let's just go ahead and do a simple donut. So it creates that object, and don't worry about what we're seeing here with the grid and everything like that. I'm going to get more in depth with that a little bit later. But what you see here in the 3D panel are all the various properties. This is basically a master list of everything that's going on with this 3D layer. We've got the environment, scene, current view. And as I select a line item, you can see the relevant properties show up right here next to it in the properties panel. So you can see how this workflow would be very efficient in that I can just select the item and then move over here and make the changes I need to and just move it all around like that. So I discovered it's a pretty efficient way for me to work in 3D. Of course, because Photoshop is so versatile and customizable, you can determine which method is best for you. A good place to start, of course, is to try that preset 3D workspace so that you can kind of see what panels are relevant if you're relatively new to 3D. And then you can kind of figure out how you go as you work, what method or what arrangement is going to be best for you. Okay, so let's get into what we're going to talk about, and that is creating 3D objects. You, of course, cannot work with 3D in Photoshop until you create or, in fact, import a 3D object. Now, importing a 3D object from another application like Maya or 3D Max or something like that is possible, and we're going to talk about that in the next video. But in this video, we're going to concentrate on creating 3D from within Photoshop. And this is one of the great things about 3D in Photoshop is that it gives you the ability to create your objects and modify them all without ever leaving the program. This is a huge advantage as 3D has progressed into in the program. So there's really two avenues you can take when you're creating 3D objects, and that's of course doing it through the 3D panel as you see right here, or of course in the 3D menu, which is up here at the very top of the interface under the 3D menu. It has its own menu here. So we'll get to those in just a moment. So let's start with the 3D panel itself. When you're inside of here and you have no 3D objects or layers selected in the layers panel or none existing, this is what the 3D panel will look like. It's in the create 3D object mode. So if you click on the source menu, you can go in here and choose selected layers, any selected layer you have. This includes text layers or image layers or even shape layers. And you can do work path. Again, this is just for path layers, or again, shape layers or vector layers, as they're called now inside Photoshop CS6, can be used to create a 3D object. You can also do a current selection and even a file. And this is going back to importing a file from another application. Again, like I said, we'll talk about in the next video. So let's just take a look at perhaps a current selection. So if I've got an image here, I'm just going to take my elliptical marquee tool and draw out a circle here. And with that active selection, all I'm going to do is just make sure it says current selection here in the source menu. I want it to create a 3D extrusion, which is my only option in this case, so it's gone ahead and selected it by default. And then go down here and click on the create button. It creates an extruded object. If I just rotate it around, you can see that it extruded that object based on that shape of the selection and has made the image on that layer the front face of that 3D object. Now I'm moving the object around or moving my view around by just using these 3D tools located in the options bar. Now these are only visible when you have the move tool selected. Notice if I click another tool, they go away. So anytime the move tool is selected and you have a 3D layer selected here, you will have those tools visible. We'll get into those a little bit more depth later. So that's creating it from a selection. Now going back a few steps, let's go back to where we had that active selection. If I were to knock out part of this selection, if I go in here and hold down my Option key on Mac, Alt on Windows, and just draw out a selection and basically subtract from that area, what's going to happen when I create my object? Well, beauty is in CS6, it now will know that that selection is knocked out, and when you create the 3D object, we'll punch that hole out in the object when it is in 3D. Pretty cool stuff. So that is using an active selection. Well, what if you have a path? I'm going to go over here and grab my shape tool, and we'll go ahead and make a shape here. And notice I'm drawing it as a shape, not a vector layer or anything like that. And with that layer selected, I'm just going to go over here and choose Work Path. Again, 3D Extrusion, click on Create, and does the same thing. There's my 3D object. And going back, again, if I were to get a different shape and go up here in the options bar and tell it to subtract from shape, if I select this item here and then draw that circle inside of this shape, now it's knocking out that shape. And if I go and do the same thing, do Work Path, 3D Extrusion, Create, and it will knock out that hole in the object. So whether you're creating whole objects or objects that have holes in them, punching them out, you will have to have the path set on the right type of setting, and it will Photoshop will go ahead and detect that and knock the shape out for you. Then of course you have selected layers, and these include images or any kind of text layer or something like that you might have. So if I were to deactivate my path here, let's go and select my layer. With my current layer selected, it's going to look at the entire layer. When you have an active selection, it's isolated to a certain area. When you have a path, it's isolated to a certain area. When you have selected layer, it looks at the entire layer. And when I create the 3D extrusion, you can see that entire layer is now a 3D block. So several different methods for creating 3D objects. Every one of them is different and give you similar results, and it's smart enough to knock out those shapes when it is necessary. Now, of course, you can also create things like 3D postcards. This is not anything new. This actually goes back to CS4, where you could create a flat 3D postcard. And if I just choose to select the layer and hit create, it's basically put that flat image in 3D space. It didn't extrude it or anything. But now it's just in a 3D space, so I can get accurate perspective on things if I needed to. So let's go ahead and undo that. And let's get rid of my path here. So 3D postcard, 3D extrusion, mesh from preset. This is where you would find your primitive shapes, things like cones and cubes and donuts, pyramids, things like that. A lot of these things are pretty silly, but for the most part are very useful. And you, once you create it, if I just go ahead and create a hat here, for instance, and we'll go ahead and click create. And you can see it wraps the texture of whatever layer I have selected around it, and I've got that 3D object with a nice texture on it. So again, numerous ways to create these objects, all from within the 3D panel. All of these features are also inside of the 3D menu. If I have a layer selected, you can see I have, and in this case, in many ways, Photoshop is smart enough to detect what it is you're trying to do in 3D. You'll notice here, it detects that I've only got a layer selected, so it's only allowing me to choose 3D extrusion from selected layer. If I had a path, for instance, if I draw a path here, if I go into that menu, it detects the path and knows that I can create from a selected path. Then if I had an active selection, it would also make that visible. Going down here to new mesh from layer, we also see those very same presets like postcard, mesh preset, there's all my primitive shapes right there, and depth maps. Again, depth map is also down here, mesh from depth map. So same features, just located in two different places. One is conveniently located in the panel if you're used to doing this kind of panel workflow, or under the 3D menu, right under 3D, right in here, just in this lower section. So two avenues to go, as I mentioned. You can go either way. They do both the same thing using either one of those types of scenarios, whether it's a path, a shape, or selection. All of them generate 3D going those ways. Now, let's get into the next video. We're going to talk about what you can do when you import a 3D object from another application.